Today I'm sharing with you a conversation I had a year ago with Ping-chen Hsiung. She's professor of history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and she has done pioneering work on childhood in China. One of her favorite quotes is to write well, express yourself like the common people, but think like a wise man. Aristotle.
I am Hsiung Ping-Chen, professor of history at Chinese University of Hong Kong. I am a trained historian, but I also have a secondary field in public health. My main research topic is history of infants and young children in late imperial China, studied interdisciplinarily and from comparative perspective. This is trying to answer historically how human life becomes possible. Namely, what happens every day now in the modern society, that whenever you give birth to a child, you expect this child will make it in life, but that's not the given in pre-modern societies. So I wanted to answer that question, and given that the Chinese documentation tend to be rich and available in many different angles from different areas. So I started this study from Chinese sources and compared with information we know about England, Sweden, Japan, India, colonial America. And then I tried to study it from historical text, but these are historical texts left by pediatricians, by art historians, by objects and things, so it required an interdisciplinary angle.
How did you get into this topic?
I was very curious when I was maybe 7 or 8 about, first of all, I felt that us children, very young children, preschool children, I think we have a sense of identity. Therefore, for instance, when I was a teenager, I saw the second sex, only the cover on the bookstore. I thought that maybe the second sex is about children and childhood as a second identity. I, opened it up, discovered that it's about women. I was a bit disappointed, although I'm a woman. I thought, therefore, children should be called a third sex. That is, children has a independent domain in terms of their sense of self, their interest, the games they play, their everyday sentiments. If you see the voting behavior or other things, you now know that there's a youth culture and that people acknowledge that age as a factor, and phases of life, that is human life, however is understood in different societies at different times, that these layers of age and the different phases of life that people go through actually form a kind of a different existential sentiment. How I got interested, I was very curious. I went to college and picked history as a major, National Taiwan University in 1971. I assumed that this is a often studied subject, and therefore you could just take a course called History of Children and Childhood of the World History. But I looked it up as a freshman, I never found it. And I graduated with a history major. I went on to history graduate school at Brown University, United States. I got a degree in history, and I started teaching. This is by then, the early 80s. I discovered that really it actually had not been studied. I was very surprised, and I couldn't sleep with the idea of not knowing. So, and I know by then there were materials to answer that question. So I said that I should just answer my own questions so that whenever I retire, I could, hang on feet in the beach and feel happy.
What can we learn from this topic?
We discovered, of course, the details about how infants were brought up from the first day, first 24 hours, first week, first month, first year, and why they're celebrated when they got to live. And that's a sort of a technical aspect. But also in that we see that how people treasure life, because death or not living is a constant reality. And so my book that's published in English, I published 3 monographs in Chinese and 1 in English on this subject. The English book is published in 2005 by Stanford University Press. The title is called A Tender Voyage, which is a rendition of a Chinese Buddhist term called Chihang, meaning that, the Indian Buddhism assumed that life is an endless suffering, and therefore people would have to try to cultivate self and try to get out of this, this cycle, this vicious cycle. The Chinese Buddhists, when they received Indian Buddhism, thought that the way to get out of this challenging situation, in addition to self-cultivation, is actually compassion and mutual help. So that's called Chihang, a tender voyage where people could help each other to get through this very difficult journey called life.
I wanted to know more about this book, and there are different reviews about it. This is by Pei Yu Wu, and you can read since Philippe Ariès' groundbreaking and provocative book L'enfant et la vie familiale sous l'Ancien Régime was published in 1960, the West has been enloaded with books on the history of children and childhood.
The French book actually was translated into English and other languages starting in the 70s and 80s. I started my study at roughly that same period. That book made a very bold and sort of startling, but then also challenging assumption. It's assumption that for Western Europe or for France primarily, that childhood may be a modern invention. It has since been studied and responded by European historians, which turned out not to be the case. But still, that was a good start in terms of discovery of childhood studies.
The book consists of 3 parts. Part 1 is about the physical conditions, and this contains also the most original important findings. In contrast to Europe, specialized medicine for children appeared considerably earlier in China. The beginning of practicing pediatrics started at least since the second half of the 11th century. Part number 2 is about social life, and here Professor Hsiung gathered information from more than 800 chronological biographies. One fully developed topic is the bond between mother and son. We can read that the depth and duration of this bond had few parallels in other societies and greatly mitigated the effects of patriarchy. And in part number 3, that is about, for example, girlhood, I feel that there is also an interesting aspect when she says that to further confront the superficial impression that gender prejudice could have worked only to the advantage of boys, it is useful to look at the privilege a young girl might have had in emotional warmth from family elders. Most families, if made to disclose, indicate that they favor a child to be a daughter. Interesting perspective, and I feel a really interesting book. What was childhood about?
When people now speaking of children or childhood or infants, because of the modern experience since the 19th century originated in Europe, but now it's everywhere, people tend to think of human existence as defined by biophysical existence. Therefore, they're thinking about infant and child in about logical sense. That is the earlier phase of a person's life, and someone who's very small and needed tender. But if you look at the Chinese documents, it started off as understanding infant and child, the concept, in three ways. There's this basic fundamental ways which Chinese pediatricians share with everybody else. They have to look after the illness of a 4-month-old or a 2-year-old, which had a different physiological condition as post-16-year-old adults. But comes a second understanding, which is what we call a social child. That is, it's a role, it's a status. Chinese people, because they would pay respect to their ancestors. So at Chinese New Year, everybody, including people who are in the 60s and 70s, would assume their role as the offspring of a genealogy. Even the emperor, the head of that empire, he calls himself Son of Heaven, which means that he's a junior. And that's a basic humility, and also it's a generational concept that assumes that there are people before you and there are people after you. So that's the second definition. A third definition actually is a existential and ethical understanding of infancy and childhood. That's the Taoist understanding of eventually everybody would go back to become an infant. It's something that's cultivated, and if you look at let's say Charlie Brown or some painting, there are people who would always be a child, always be a 5-year-old, 3-year-old, even infant, because at that time people had not had a notion of a time as a linear progression. That people think that okay, you could stay forever young, or that you could do your exercise and cultivate, and you become a child again. I think those three different ways of understanding the beginnings of life, and the existential state and the social role, at least allow people to have multiple choices, and it's a good cultural diversity, I would say. So that is something that Chinese or the inhabitants of continental East Asia happen to start up with. I don't like to say that Chinese civilization always held secret to everything else, or it's older, because I think the relations between different cultures and civilization is not a competition about who's winning, or who's gotten it better, or who's wiser, or who's smarter, or who's better. But I just think that different people living in different circumstances in different places happen to have different notions, different ideas, different practices, and this is one thing that I discovered in my study I would like to share.
What is the most important lesson that you have learned?
When I give lectures about my study, people always say that, how can you document stories of 6-month infants from hundreds of years ago? I said, of course you could, as long as you would give it your hardest attention and try. And because I think as historians, we could also document silence, and then to interpret the empty space. The people whose lives have vanished will be just like the open space in a painting. There's always the void. What is not there help us to understand and interpret what's there. We have to be able as historians to document the missing lives and empty space and the silences better.
How can we use our past, our different past, to create a common future?
Yeah. I think that, historical population, have installed, sort of, if you will, a database of circumstances, how they work and enjoyed and endured different circumstances. So it would be a lost if, it's just like a forest, if you only decided to, preserve, quote, the most useful plant for current consideration, then you would lose a lot, because in the forest, in the water, you want all forms of life to be able to carry on. So I certainly would like to say, when I talk with people in social sciences or sciences who tend to work with more contemporary data or think about future sort of problems, I would say that these are also useful information. They're humans too, and then it will be a shame if we decided to drop that and assuming that we could still, have enough information, inspiration, and then all kinds of stories to carry on for the future. And, I also hope that humanities and arts would not only have a confrontational relations with science, engineering, and people who have other interests, because I see in all kinds of real circumstances, you need people with different expertise, different experience, different interests to come and work together. No singular subject or discipline could complete a service or a task without the help of other people.
If you could travel through time, where and when would you like to be?
If I were to be able to travel back in time, I know there are times and places whereby people really mingle and boundaries do not matter as much. For instance, the Inner Asian border, between the 6th and 9th century, I would like to be there. I had just been to Urumqi. Because I know that there are Indian eye doctors who would fix people's eyes, there are Persian musicians who would perform a show, and there are, all kinds of traders, and people use all kinds of languages. So that would be the kind of place that could satisfy my curiosity.
And what kind of question would you have?
Oh, then, no, then it'll be like me going to the market every day. I love to look at things. I like to go to different markets and to see, what life has to offer. I don't have any particular informative questions to ask them, but I think it will be a joy to see how life flourishes in places and times when boundaries met less and when people mingle more easily.
Do you have a dream?
I have lots and lots of dreams. I actually, have a lot of dreams, real dreams every day. I dream easily, and even when I doze off for a few minutes, I could have a dream. And sometimes I can't tell the difference between the dream or real life. I tend to think that our life, the difference between dream and a real life is, but the dreams that you encountered is so real that maybe it would just things that would become real life in the next step.
What is your next book?
My next book is one that's going to be documenting the life of a provincial intellectual in 17th century China who somehow, because of his sort of failed life, dreamed of something big, and then people said 300 years later, said that he's very modern. So this is a book I'm publishing. In terms of project, because I had studied infants and children for 30 years, now I'm looking at the other end, meaning aging, understood and observed cross-culturally.
you research on childhood. You are going to research on the end of our life. What is life about? What is life?
Yeah, what is life about? As I said, it shouldn't be only about a biophysical existence. It includes life as understood socially, culturally, aesthetically, but it should also define affinity. Like I also teach history of family. I said your closest ones may not be the blood king. It could be the people who rub shoulder with you, when you have a flat tire, in deep winter, the people who stop and help you. That's your closest king. And so what is life? It depends. What is life, I would say, is what you decided to make of it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Keep wondering and see you soon again. Bye and ciao.